The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind of silence you savor after a long day, but the eerie, calculated kind, like someone was holding their breath, waiting to see if they'd been caught. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Grace wasn't home. That wasn't unusual. She told me she was taking Lily to a volunteer project downtown. But then Lily called me from her friend's house, asking if I could pick her up later because she and Grace had a fight, and Grace had dropped her off, saying she'd be back in a few hours. I tried calling Grace. No answer. I texted her. Just a quick, "Where are you?" Nothing. That gnawing pit in my stomach wasn't new, but this time it felt sharper, more urgent. So I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I opened her laptop. The password was the same as it had been a decade ago. I'm not proud of how fast my fingers flew across the keys. At first, there was nothing: emails to PDA groups, shopping receipts, random Pinterest boards. But then I found it. A folder hidden in the depths of her documents. The name was bland, Household Finances. But inside, it wasn't spreadsheets or bills. It was legal drafts, divorce papers, and not just drafts. She'd already filled out the forms, signed her name in that confident, looping handwriting I used to admire. I felt the blood drain from my face as I scanned through the documents. She wasn't just leaving me. She wanted the house, the cars, full custody of the kids, and half my retirement savings. The woman who couldn't be bothered to balance a checkbook was suddenly a financial strategist, and I was the target. But here's the thing. I'm not just any guy. I've spent 20 years in corporate law, untangling messy disputes and outmaneuvering people who think they're untouchable. I know how to play the long game. And Grace, for all her careful planning, had underestimated me. Big mistake. Still, I needed more. Evidence. Motive. Her why. That's when I noticed another file in the folder. A scanned receipt for a hotel booking. One night, 2 people. The date? 3 days ago. The name? Aiden Porter. That bastard. I didn't rage. Instead, I closed the laptop, poured myself a glass of bourbon, and sat at the dining room table. My mind was already working, calculating my next move. Grace thought she'd planned everything perfectly, but she had no idea what she'd just unleashed. I didn't wait for Grace to come home that evening. Instead, I decided to visit the hotel listed on the receipt. The address was etched in my mind, and my heart raced as I pulled into the parking lot. It wasn't a fancy place. More of a mid-tier spot where people go to keep things discreet. At the front desk, I put on my best poker face. "Hi. I believe my wife left her scarf here earlier this week. Grace Porter. I think the reservation might have been under her name or her friends. Aiden." I kept my tone casual, friendly. The kind of tone that doesn't raise suspicion. The receptionist, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tapped away at his computer. "Yeah, we had a Grace Porter here a few days ago. Checked in with an Aiden Porter. You can check the lost and found if you want." He motioned toward a bin behind the counter. I nodded, pretending to care about the scarf. Meanwhile, my mind was spinning. She'd checked in under his last name. They were already playing house, pretending they were married while she was plotting to gut our life together. I thanked the guy, grabbed some random scarf from the bin to keep up appearances, and walked out of there. As I got back into my car, I couldn't help but feel the humiliation sink in. Grace wasn't just cheating. She was building a life with this man while tearing mine apart behind my back. And the audacity of it, using our money to pay for her little rendezvous. My jaw tightened, and for the first time I felt something other than shock or hurt. I felt rage. But rage wouldn't fix this. If anything, it would give her the upper hand. So, I called my old friend Mark, a private investigator I'd worked with on corporate fraud cases. Mark was the guy you called when you needed the truth, no matter how buried it was. "John, long time," Mark answered after a few rings. "I need your help," I said, cutting straight to the point. "It's personal this time." He let out a low whistle. "You're not the type to call for personal stuff. Must be bad." "It's worse than bad," I replied, gripping the steering wheel. "I need you to dig into someone. His name is Aiden Porter. He's screwing my wife, and I need everything. Where he works, where he lives, who else he's screwing, for that matter." Mark chuckled darkly. "You always did have a way with words. Send me what you've got, and I'll start digging." By the time I got home, Grace was back. She was in the kitchen, humming some upbeat song while chopping vegetables. She didn't even look up as I walked in. "Hey babe, Lily said you were picking her up. Everything okay?" Her nonchalance was like a slap in the face. I stared at her for a moment, marveling at how easily she could slip into the role of doting wife, like she hadn't spent the week betraying me. "Everything's fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "I just had some errands to run." "Good," she said, flashing me a grin. "I was thinking we could do a family dinner tomorrow. Maybe grill in the backyard? It's been a while." The nerve of this woman. She was planning to rip our family apart. And here she was, talking about backyard barbecues like nothing was wrong. I nodded, playing along, but inside, I was already planning my next move. Grace thought she was in control, but the game had just started. She didn't know I'd been to that hotel. She didn't know about Mark. And she sure as hell didn't know that I wasn't going to take this lying down. The following morning, Mark called me with an update. "You're not going to like this," he started. And I could hear the edge in his voice. "Your boy Aiden? He's got quite the history. Multiple failed business ventures, a couple of lawsuits, and a long trail of women he's left high and dry." I gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of lawsuits?" "Financial fraud, mostly. Borrowed money, never paid it back. The guy's a walking disaster. But here's the kicker, he's got no real income. He's living off whoever's stupid enough to trust him." I felt my stomach churn. Grace had hitched her wagon to a grifter, and she didn't even know it. Or worse, she knew and didn't care. Either way, this wasn't just a betrayal anymore. It was a ticking time bomb, and I was determined to make sure I wasn't the one caught in the blast. "Keep digging," I told Mark. "I need everything you can find." When I hung up, Grace was in the living room, scrolling through her phone with a smug little smile on her face. She looked up when she saw me and tilted her head. "You seem tense. Work problems?" I forced a laugh. "Something like that. You know how it is." Her smile widened, and it took everything in me not to rip the phone out of her hand and demand answers. Instead, I went upstairs to my office and called my own lawyer, Richard. He'd been my go-to guy for years, and if anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. "Rich, I need your expertise," I began, pacing the room. "It's personal and it's urgent." "Lay it on me," he said. I explained the situation, Grace's affair, the divorce papers, her ridiculous demands. When I finished, there was a long pause. "She's trying to take you to the cleaners," Richard finally said. "But you've got options. She doesn't know you've seen those papers yet, right?" "Not a clue." "Good. We'll use that to our advantage. Let her think she's calling the shots while we set the stage. If she wants to fight dirty, we'll be ready." I felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. Grace might think she had this all figured out, but she didn't understand the game she was playing. She was dealing with someone who'd spent his career outsmarting people just like her and her slimy boyfriend. When I came downstairs later, Grace was packing a bag. "I'm heading out for the day," she said breezily. "Lunch with a friend." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Have fun." As she walked out the door, I couldn't help but smile. She thought she was so clever, but her overconfidence was her biggest weakness. Little did she know, every move she made was bringing her closer to checkmate. Grace didn't come home that night until nearly midnight. I stayed up, not out of worry, but to watch her walk through the door. When she finally arrived, she smelled like cheap perfume and vodka, her hair slightly disheveled. She gave me a lazy wave, her eyes half-lidded. "Late night?" I asked casually, leaning against the kitchen counter with a glass of water in hand. "Yeah, lost track of time," she muttered, kicking off her heels. She didn't even bother coming up with an excuse this time. That smug attitude of hers was really starting to grate on me, but I kept my cool. Let her think I was still the clueless husband. "Everything okay?" I pressed, curious to see if she'd even try to lie. "Of course." She yawned dramatically and waved me off. "I'm exhausted. Going to bed." I watched her shuffle upstairs, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. That phone held answers, and I was done waiting for them to fall into my lap. The next morning, while Grace was in the shower, I took my chance. She always left her phone charging on the bathroom counter, which was a reckless mistake for someone with as much to hide as she did. I slipped in, grabbed the phone, and entered her passcode, her birthday. Too easy. What I found wasn't shocking at this point, but it was enraging. Text after text with Aiden, each more nauseating than the last. He wasn't just her fling. He was her partner in crime. They were talking about my money, our kids, and even how they'd handle me once the divorce went through. Grace had even sent him photos of jewelry she wanted to buy once the settlement comes through. But one message stood out above the rest. It was from Aiden. You better make sure he doesn't see this coming. If he fights back, we're screwed. My blood ran cold. They weren't just planning a clean break. They were strategizing how to take everything from me and leave me with nothing. By the time Grace got out of the shower, I was already in my office, forwarding everything to Mark and Richard. The texts, the photos, the receipts, they had everything they needed to take these two down. But I wasn't going to wait for the courts to handle this. No, this was personal now. Grace thought she could play me, but she had no idea the lengths I was willing to go to protect my family and my future. Later that day, I made a point to act normal, even cheerful. Grace, oblivious as ever, didn't suspect a thing. She was busy texting Aiden under the table during dinner, thinking she was so clever. I didn't care anymore. Let her dig her hole deeper. I had a meeting with Richard that night. We sat in his office, surrounded by piles of legal books and documents, plotting my next move. John, he said, leaning forward, this isn't just about winning. This is about making sure they never recover. Are you ready for that? I didn't hesitate. Do it. Whatever it takes. Grace and Aiden thought they were ahead of the game, but they had no idea I'd already flipped the board. The following week, the pieces began falling into place. Richard and I crafted a strategy that was as intricate as it was ruthless. Grace and Aiden had overplayed their hand, and I was about to turn their arrogance into their downfall. First, we quietly restructured my financial holdings. Grace knew just enough about my work to think she understood how corporate law worked, but in reality, she didn't have a clue. I created a shell company to absorb my business's liabilities, ensuring that the debts I'd been strategically building would transfer directly to her in the divorce. It was a perfectly legal move, albeit one that bordered on cutthroat. Meanwhile, Mark had uncovered something even juicier. Aiden wasn't just a grifter. He was in deep financial trouble. He owed tens of thousands to multiple creditors, and his accounts were practically empty. Grace was essentially hitching her future to a sinking ship. The irony was delicious. By the end of the week, I'd set up a meeting with Richard to finalize the paperwork. Once this hits the court, she won't know what hit her, Richard assured me, sliding a thick stack of documents across the desk. And Aiden? I asked. Richard smirked. He'll go down with her. The moment they tie their fates together, his financial problems become hers, too. The beauty of the plan wasn't just in its precision. It was in its timing. Grace was moving forward with the divorce, smugly assuming she held all the cards. I let her think that, playing the role of the defeated husband while making quiet moves in the background. That weekend, Grace decided to announce her intentions over dinner. It was just the two of us at the table. The kids were at a friend's house for the night. She poured herself a glass of wine and stared at me with that fake look of pity that made my skin crawl. John, she began, her tone syrupy sweet. I've been thinking a lot about our future. I think it's time we both moved on. You'll find someone better suited to you, and I think Aiden and I held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Grace, I said calmly, you don't need to explain. If this is what you want, I won't stand in your way. Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, I saw the flicker of confusion. She hadn't expected me to take it so well. Oh, well, I'm glad you understand. I'll have my lawyer contact you about dividing everything fairly. Of course, I said with a small smile. Fair is fair. Inside, I was practically laughing. She had no idea that fair was about to become her worst nightmare. After dinner, she disappeared upstairs to make a call, undoubtedly to Aiden. I could hear her giggling through the walls, probably gloating about how smoothly things were going. Little did she know, her perfect plan was crumbling under her feet. The next day, I received an email from her lawyer with a list of demands. The house, half my retirement, child support, spousal support, even my car. I forwarded the email to Richard with a simple note. Let's begin. Grace thought she'd already won. What she didn't realize was that the game was just getting started. And in this game, I made the rules. Grace's arrogance was almost comical at this point. Over the next few days, she strutted around the house like she'd already moved out, humming to herself as she packed little boxes labeled with sticky notes. Master bedroom, kitchen, Lily's stuff. She didn't even bother hiding it anymore. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, pretending to read emails on my laptop, while in reality, I was fine-tuning the final phase of my plan with Richard and Mark. The court date was set for 2 weeks later. Grace, confident she had this in the bag, was practically giddy. She even started talking openly about her fresh start. One morning, as she poured herself a cup of coffee, she looked at me with a sickeningly fake expression of sympathy. "You know, John," she said, leaning against the counter, "this doesn't have to be so hard. We can keep things civil. The kids will adjust and you'll see. It'll all work out." I nodded, playing the defeated husband perfectly. "Of course, Grace. I just want what's best for everyone." Her smile widened. "I knew you'd come around." What she didn't know was that every word she spoke was adding fuel to the fire. Her overconfidence was so blinding. She didn't notice how carefully I was watching every move she made. Mark sent me a message that afternoon. "Final details locked. You're going to love this." The details were exquisite. Grace had been funneling small amounts of cash out of our joint account into a separate one she shared with Aiden. That account, thanks to Mark's digging, was now flagged for potential fraud. If she thought her new life was going to start smoothly, she was in for a rude awakening. But that wasn't the centerpiece of the plan. The real knockout punch was buried in the financial restructuring Richard had orchestrated. My company's liabilities, strategically and legally reallocated, meant that Grace's share of the assets in the divorce would come with a crushing weight of debt. She wanted the house. She'd get it, along with the mortgage and a lien that would keep her drowning for years. She wanted spousal support. The courts would see a business owner hemorrhaging money and struggling to stay afloat. 2 days before the hearing, Grace's lawyer sent over another smug email, reiterating her demands. I replied with a simple, one-sentence response. "We'll see you in court." When the day finally arrived, Grace was practically glowing as she walked into the courtroom, Aiden trailing behind her like some self-satisfied lapdog. I kept my expression neutral, even friendly, as I shook hands with her lawyer. Let them think I was just here to roll over and sign the papers. The proceedings began with the usual formalities. Grace's lawyer laid out her demands with all the self-assurance of someone who thought they'd already won. The house, the cars, the accounts, even a ridiculous alimony figure. Grace sat there with a smug smile, throwing occasional glances in my direction as if to say, "I've got you." Then it was Richard's turn. He rose slowly, buttoning his jacket, and began laying out our case. He presented the financial records, the debts, the liabilities, all of it meticulously documented. By the time he was done, the room was silent except for the sound of Grace shifting uncomfortably in her chair. Her smile was gone, replaced by a look of confusion that quickly turned to panic. "What does this mean?" Grace whispered to her lawyer, loud enough for me to hear. "It means," Richard said, his voice steady and sharp, "that my client is not only unable to meet your client's demands, but your client is now legally responsible for 50% of all outstanding liabilities associated with the division of property." Grace's lawyer paled. "That's impossible. She's entitled to." Richard cut him off. "Entitled? Certainly. To half of everything. That includes the debts." The judge looked over the paperwork, nodding as Richard explained. "Everything appears to be in order. The division of assets will proceed as outlined." Court adjourned. Grace stood there, frozen, as if the reality of what had just happened hadn't quite sunk in. Aiden, looking equally stunned, leaned in to whisper something to her, but she shoved him away and stormed out of the courtroom. I stayed seated, letting the moment sink in. Grace had played her hand, and she'd lost. The weight of her new reality was just beginning to crush her, and I wasn't about to stop it. As we walked out of the courtroom, I could feel Grace's fury radiating behind me like a heat wave. She didn't say a word at first, probably because she was still trying to process how her perfect plan had unraveled in the span of an hour. Aiden trailed after her like a lost puppy, his usual smugness replaced by a blank, panicked expression. "John!" Grace's voice finally cut through the air as I reached the courthouse steps. I turned slowly, forcing a calm expression onto my face as she stormed toward me. Aiden hung back, clearly afraid of what might happen next. Smart move. What the hell was that? She hissed, her face flushed with anger. You tricked me. This isn't fair. I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. Fair? You want to talk about fair, Grace? You've been lying to me, stealing from me, and plotting behind my back for months. And now that you've finally been caught, this is what you're upset about. Her eyes narrowed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You ruined everything. You think this is over? You think I'm just going to walk away? I took a step closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. Grace, let me give you a little advice. Stop digging. The hole you're in is already deep enough. Keep pushing, and you'll only make it worse. For a moment, I thought she might slap me. Instead, she spun on her heel and stormed off, dragging Aiden along with her. I watched them go, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. For months, I'd been the one blindsided and humiliated. Now, the tables had turned, and Grace was the one facing the consequences of her own actions. Later that evening, I sat down with the kids to explain what had happened. I kept it simple, focusing on the practicalities rather than the messy details. Noah, ever the pragmatic one, nodded quietly as I spoke, while Lily looked a little more shaken. So, what happens now? Noah finally asked. We move forward, I said firmly. It'll be different, but we'll be okay. I promise. Grace, meanwhile, was unraveling. Over the next few days, I heard from mutual friends that she and Aiden were already fighting. The debts she'd taken on were suffocating, and Aiden, predictably, was starting to distance himself. Mark confirmed that several of Aiden's creditors were closing in, and without any real assets to his name, he had nowhere to run. By the end of the week, Grace called me. I didn't expect it, but I wasn't surprised either. Her voice was shaky, almost desperate. John, we need to talk. I let the silence hang for a moment before responding. About what, Grace? She hesitated. The kids? And maybe we could work something out, for old time's sake. It was laughable. After everything she'd done, she thought I'd just sweep it under the rug? Grace, I said evenly, the only thing we need to discuss is the schedule for you to see the kids. As for everything else, you made your choices. Now you live with them. She started to say something else, but I hung up. There was nothing left to say. Grace had built her new life on lies and greed, and now it was crumbling beneath her. Watching her flail was more satisfying than I'd ever admit out loud. This wasn't just a victory, it was justice. The fallout was swift and brutal, and Grace was at the center of it. Within days of our courtroom showdown, she started calling me almost daily, each message more desperate than the last. I didn't answer. Why should I? She had made her bed, and now she was tangled in it with Aiden. Mark, ever the professional, kept feeding me updates. Aiden's financial house of cards had finally collapsed. Creditors were pursuing him aggressively, and without a dime to his name, they were coming after Grace too. Apparently, Aiden had sweet-talked her into co-signing some shady loan agreements. Now she was on the hook for debts she hadn't even known existed, at least until now. Looks like Aiden's skipping town, Mark told me over the phone. Last I heard, he packed up and disappeared. Grace might be stuck holding the bag on this one. That was when I realized the poetic justice of it all. Grace had betrayed me, humiliated me, and tried to destroy the life we'd built together, only to end up abandoned and drowning in the mess she and Aiden had created. And the irony? She hadn't just lost me. She'd lost the trust of our kids too. Noah, who'd always been the quieter of the two, finally spoke up one evening after dinner. Dad, he said, pushing his plate away. Do we have to see Mom? I don't want to. Lily nodded, her expression serious. She lied to us, Dad. She told me she was doing everything for us, but she didn't even care. I took a deep breath, the weight of their words hitting me harder than I expected. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with, I assured them. If you don't want to see her, I'll make sure you don't have to. The relief on their faces was immediate. Grace had underestimated a lot of things, But perhaps her biggest mistake was thinking the kids wouldn't see through her. Meanwhile, Grace's life continued to spiral. Her calls to me became more frantic, and when I didn't answer, she started leaving voicemails laced with thinly veiled threats and pathetic attempts at guilt-tripping. "I can't believe you're doing this to me, John. You're turning the kids against me. Do you really want me to lose everything? We can fix this. Just call me back." But there was no fixing it. Grace's lawyer reached out next, trying to negotiate new terms for visitation and finances. But Richard handled that with his usual efficiency. "Let her know," he said to the opposing counsel, "that we're done negotiating. The court order stands." The final blow came when Grace tried to appeal the divorce ruling, thinking she could claw back some of the assets she'd lost. The judge dismissed her case almost immediately, citing lack of evidence and a mountain of poor decisions on her part. Her lawyer didn't even bother to look me in the eye as we left the courtroom. Grace's world was collapsing, and all she could do was watch. Her texts and voicemails went from angry and accusatory to pitiful and pleading. But I didn't care. I had my kids, my life, and my freedom back, and that was worth more than anything she had tried to take from me. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The storm was over, and Grace was left standing in its wreckage, alone. Grace's descent into chaos was almost painful to watch. Almost. She had gone from the smug, calculating woman who thought she'd outsmarted everyone to a shadow of her former self. The creditors were relentless, seizing what little assets she had left. Aiden, unsurprisingly, was gone without a trace, leaving her to clean up the mess he'd created. But Grace wasn't just financially ruined. Word had gotten out about her affair and her failed attempt to gut me in the divorce. Our community wasn't huge and people talked. Friends she'd once bragged to were now keeping their distance. The PTA moms, the ones she used to gossip with over wine, suddenly stopped returning her calls. Even her own family seemed reluctant to step in and help. She had burned every bridge, and now she was stranded on an island of her own making. The kids, meanwhile, were thriving. With Grace out of the picture, our home had become a sanctuary of sorts. Lily started painting again, something she'd given up months ago when the tension in the house became unbearable. Noah, ever the realist, began applying to colleges, telling me he wanted to study business. "To make sure no one can ever take advantage of me," he'd said with a pointed look. Despite everything, I wanted to make sure the kids were okay emotionally. One night, as we sat in the living room watching a movie, I decided to bring it up. "You know, if either of you ever wants to talk about what happened with your mom, I'm here," I said gently. Noah shrugged. "She made her choices, Dad. I don't feel bad for her." Lily hesitated for a moment, then added, "I just don't get why she thought we wouldn't find out. Like, did she think we were stupid?" Their words hit me harder than I expected. Grace hadn't just betrayed me. She'd betrayed them. And kids, no matter how resilient, don't forget something like that. As for Grace, the final nail in her coffin came when her house of lies started collapsing publicly. One day, I got a call from Mark. "John, you're going to want to see this," he said, sending me a link to a video. It was a news clip about Aiden. Apparently, one of his creditors had finally tracked him down, and in the process, uncovered a web of fraudulent activities that stretched back years. Grace, who had tied herself to him so tightly, was implicated by association. The video didn't mention her by name, but anyone paying attention would know. Couldn't help but chuckle. Grace had spent months plotting to destroy me, and now her life was in ruins because she trusted the wrong man. It was poetic justice, plain and simple. That evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of bourbon, watching the sunset, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Grace's belongings had long since been cleared out, her presence reduced to nothing more than a distant memory. The kids were happy. I was free. And Grace? She was finally learning that actions have consequences. She tried to take everything from me, but in the end, she was the one left with nothing. A few weeks later, Grace reached out again, but this time it wasn't with rage or desperation. It was with defeat. Her voice, once sharp and smug, sounded hollow on the voicemail she left. "John, it's me. I need to talk. Please, just one conversation. For the kids' sake." It was a line she hadn't tried before, and I could tell she was grasping at straws. The kids didn't want anything to do with her. and she was using them as a last-ditch attempt to pull me back into her mess. I debated whether to ignore it like all the others, but something told me this time was different. The next day, I agreed to meet her at a neutral spot, a cafe we used to go to when things were good. Sitting across from her now, I could barely recognize the woman I'd once married. She looked worn down, her expensive clothes hanging loosely on her frame. She fidgeted with her coffee cup, avoiding my gaze. "Thanks for coming," she started, her voice shaky. "I didn't think you would." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. "What do you want, Grace?" She flinched at my tone but quickly composed herself. I wanted to apologize," she said quietly, "for everything. I messed up. I see that now." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "You see that now? After everything you've done?" Her eyes welled up, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen too many of her performances to trust any of it. "I was stupid," she admitted. "Aiden, he fooled me. I thought he loved me, but he was just using me." I let out a bitter laugh. "You think I care about what Aiden did to you? You lied, cheated, and tried to take everything from me and our kids. And now that you're left with nothing, you expect me to forgive you." She looked down, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to see the kids. Please, John. I've lost everything. Don't take them away from me too." Her words hung in the air, but they didn't have the impact she was hoping for. I had no sympathy left to give her. "Grace, the kids don't want to see you. That's not my decision. It's theirs. Maybe if you'd thought about them before you destroyed our family, things would be different." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she just nodded, defeated. I understand." I stood, tossing a few bills on the table to cover the coffee. "I hope you figure out how to fix your life, Grace, but don't drag me or the kids into it." As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange sense of closure. Grace had finally admitted defeat, and while it didn't erase the damage she'd done, it was enough to know she was facing the consequences of her actions. Back home, I told the kids about the meeting. Noah just shook his head. "She only cares because she lost. If she'd won, she wouldn't even look back." Lily didn't say anything, but the way she hugged me afterwards said everything I needed to know. We were okay, and Grace's apology, as hollow as it was, had no power over us anymore. The storm was finally over, and for the first time in years, our future felt bright. Grace had played her games, but in the end, she lost. We had won, not just the court battle but our lives back. And that victory was the sweetest of all. Months passed, and the dust finally settled. Life without Grace was quieter, simpler, and, above all, happier. The kids and I found a rhythm that worked for us. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving. Grace's name rarely came up in conversation anymore. When it did, it was in passing, a relic of a past we had left far behind. She hadn't tried to contact the kids again, likely realizing that her pleas would only push them further away. From what little I heard through the grapevine, she was barely getting by. The debts, the humiliation, and Aiden's abandonment had stripped her of the life she'd tried to steal. She was renting a small apartment on the edge of town and working part-time at a boutique. The once proud Grace, who used to flaunt her supposed perfection, was now just another face in the crowd. One day, I got an email from Mark. Attached was a photo of Aiden, disheveled and looking like he'd aged 10 years. He had been arrested on charges of fraud in another state. Grace's perfect partner was finally facing the music. I couldn't help but smile. Some people never learn. Meanwhile, I poured my energy into the kids and my career. Noah got accepted into his first-choice college, and Lily was thriving in her art classes. We took a vacation to the mountains, something we hadn't done in years, and spent days hiking, laughing, and simply enjoying each other's company. For the first time in what felt like forever, our family felt whole. One afternoon, as I stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, I reflected on everything that had happened. Grace's betrayal, the lies, the courtroom drama. It all seemed like a lifetime ago. I had come out of it stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to protect the people who truly mattered. If there's one thing I learned from this experience, it's that you can't always see betrayal coming. Creeps in, subtle at first, until one day it's staring you in the face. But what defines you isn't the betrayal, it's how you respond. Grace thought she could destroy me, but she only made me stronger. In the end, her schemes didn't just fail. They backfired spectacularly. The kids joined me on the porch, Noah with a soda in hand and Lily clutching her sketchpad. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" Noah asked. I smiled at them, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. "Just how lucky I am," I said. Lily grinned. "Lucky? After everything that happened?" I nodded. "Because we made it through. Together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Grace had lost everything she'd gambled on, but I had won something far more valuable. My freedom, my family, and a future free of her lies. Justice had been served, and I was finally, truly at peace.